Hello, and welcome to the extra creative video. First things first, I gotta point out, I actually put on a collar shirt. Hey, I dressed up a little bit. Don't worry though, I'm still wearing shorts, but it's dressing up just a little bit. This is an extra credit video, so while it's related to the course, it is not directly related to the course. What I mean by that is, this covers like advanced stuff or next level stuff, extra stuff, connected a little bit to public speaking, but in no way are you going to get questions on a test related to this video. In no way, I'm getting a little closer because the AC's on. In no way will you get, are you required to know this stuff for your speeches. It might help your speeches, but the way it's connected to this course is this course is divided into 3 sections, and this section was about future planning. In your first speech, we talked about demographics and reaching to an audience and trying to be inclusive and so forth. This adds to it, and what I mean by adding to it, it goes over some basic information, some concepts that I introduce and talk about in other subjects that I cover, in communication studies and in political science. And those 2 subjects are this: intercultural in communication studies, a very great, very important class, highly recommend you taking it, and then international relations and political science. The ability to communicate with other cultures, other communities, is one of the best things you can learn as a public speaker. And intercultural, it's about connecting with different groups that are connected to each other already. The interdependent stuff. I'm not going to go over definitions and so forth. But it is something to be aware of in public speaking, because I mean, you can look around us in our diverse culture and globalism and so forth. So this video will cover 3 areas that is connected to intercultural and international relations. Now, the way the videos work, unlike discussion videos, the extra credit videos, the only way you're going to get the questions is watching the videos, and so you have to listen up. And then when we get to the questions, I recommend that you pause it, and then you can go down to replies and put your answer in your reply. Now, don't make multiple replies. Put all your answers into one reply. You can write on a different piece of paper and then reply later, or whatever you do to make it easy for you. But all your responses to the questions are in one reply, okay? And this is how all the videos are going to run. So you have to actually watch the videos, thus it being extra credit. Alright, so again, this is connected to intercultural and international relations. And the one thing that you hear me say throughout the course, and I actually say this in a lot of my courses for both disciplines, is when you're trying to talk about people's what people believe, what people want, what people do, it's all related to their self-interest. We are selfish in nature, and that's not bad. It's a survival instinct. But our self-interest is what pushes us. It is what we connect to. You know, my love of soul music. There's some self-interest in my love of soul music. You know, I grew up in my neighborhood listening to rap music and hip-hop, and that naturally progressed into other forms of music, because a lot of the stuff I listen to is connected to that stuff, and I just went back in time kind of way. It was in my self-interest to develop that musically. Now, when you're talking about culture and community, because that's, you know, the first part of the class, we talked about reaching out to different groups and demographics and inclusion and all that stuff. There's 3 areas I want to focus on in relation to self-interest. The first is this thing I talk about in my when I talk about intercultural, which is diversity of one. We're all diverse in our own different ways. You hear me talk a lot about culture, and I use culture instead of a lot of stuff they say in demographics. So instead of saying ethnicity, and I talk about African Americans or white Americans or Latinx community, you'll hear me say Latinx culture, or white, you know, white culture, or black culture, or stuff like that. Same thing with male, female culture, straight, gay culture, Catholic. It goes on and on, because there's so much depth in an individual culture. And you maybe remember me saying that the Latinx community here in Los Angeles is different than the Latinx community I grew up with in and around in Fresno, California, where I'm from. Same thing for so much. So there's a bigger and better example of this, and that is descendants, African descendants across the world. Now, FYI, the story of African descendants across the globe is something that needs to be told and compared to a lot more. It's one of those things that you wish Hollywood would do, because not only would it be important, but it would make a whole lot of money. And that is the idea, just comparative and looking at the individual stories and the development of African descendants across the world. And of course that is connected with the slave trade, immigration, and so forth, and we find ourselves the descendants in four different things. And it's important to understand culture, because even though all the examples I give are all descendants of the Africans that moved from slavery or immigration, there's so many differences. So I use this, and this is look high tech. This is high tech here. So I use the example. So if we had 4 men of African descent from around the world, from different places, they all the same age, by the way, and for all intents and purposes, they're all men, straight men. Okay, so all no mix, African descent from 4 different parts of the world: the United States, Europe, Mexico, and Iraq. And why is this important? Why do I bring this up? Because while it's accurately portrayed as for people with the same ethnicity and this ancestry in the African descent ancestry, there is so much difference in those 4, and there's so much variation in the individual culture. So they might be of African descendants culture, but that's African American, African American. I always have to do that. African European, African Mexican, and African Iraqi. And there's so many things. So let me just identify what I'm talking about. With the American, most likely to be Baptist or Christian in faith. Economic levels from working poor to middle class, poverty, and so forth, and can go higher up. There is regionalism in there. There is so many different other attributes, demographics, variation. In Europe, and again, descendants mostly from slavery. In Europe, it's descendants mostly of immigration. And this is generational for lots of generations, a little bit variation of newer immigration status, all right? So, and the religious aspect can be a wide variety, to where it can actually be non-denominational and stuff like that. You can have economic status all different. There is a lots of different variation. Languages, of course, are different. While this one is predominantly English, this one can be lots of different languages. So there's lots of variations in that, and they are not all European. There are, you know, African German, African French, African English, British, so many variations. You understand? So there's so much there. Same thing with now Mexico is a lot of difference. Just recently, they weren't identified by the Mexican government. You know how census there's, you know, the common the big ethnicities and other, they weren't even added into other. And economically, we're talking working poor, some middle class, but in poverty. A group that is not largely identified. But there is some closeness, Catholicism, and so forth. So there is a lots of variation. And lastly, the Iraqi. I learned a lot about them during the Iraq invasion and occupation, because when President Obama became president, the number one name for new children was Obama. And the reason why I bring them up is, again, variation, working poor, poverty, Muslim, lots of different things, and Christian. When you talk about Christians in Iraq, there could be some found here too. So you can see lots of variations there. So when you talk about all these different groups and all these different possibilities, culture is one of the best words to use. And so my first question to you is this. I got to read it again. There are so many demographics out there that can link all of us together. I want you to name some of the surprising ones out there that can talk about. So for example, with the Europeans, African descent of Europeans, I mentioned that variations of language. And in all those examples, the religions were different in a wide regard. So think about other possibilities of variations in demographics. I introduced the idea of geography. Military status. Some of those examples, they can't serve in the military, or they don't commonly serve in the military. But military, like for Americans, it's a whole demographic to themselves. Anyone who's been involved in the military, that's a whole different demographic. Think about uncommon demographics and just write out a couple of them that you think of that we don't commonly talk about. You can talk about ones I mentioned, geography, and so forth. You can mention things and identify, because that shows a variation. Think about yourself. I don't want TMI or things that you might be, you don't want to say, but think about stuff in your own community that you're surprised about. We were teaching, when I was teaching at Cal State LA, and we had in front of my class was pretty much 90%, this one class was 85% Latinx, and then the other big demographic after that was Asian American, and pretty much that was it. So we were going through the website, and then we stumbled upon the tennis team, I think it was, for Cal State LA, and it was pretty much all white students. Talk about things that, just uncommon demographics, things that you can stick out, you can figure out, and bring variation to culture. All right? Just talk about variety in demographics. And give an example, 2 or 3 sentences, that's it. All right? All right, enough of that. The next section is this thing called intersectionality. I'm not going to define it, I'm not going to go over it in detail, but the common thing I always talk about with it is, the idea is we all have burdens on our society. It's just that when you have part of different demographics, you have more burdens on you. So if you are black in America, you have to deal with racism and so forth. If you're a black woman in America, you have to now deal with sexism and so forth. If you're a black woman who's gay, you have to deal with homophobia and so forth. So I always said intersectionality, the best way to understand intersectionality is to imagine metal bars on somebody, and the more that diversity that comes in, the more the oppression, the more the stuff that people get set back on is put on somebody, the heavier the burden is. So how do you a common question I ask on intersectionality is, how do you explain racism to white people? How do you talk about the burden of racism to white people? Yeah, to my people. Yes, I know. And so on the other one, you're supposed to pause and go and answer a question. This one is going to say the same thing. Intersectionality is that a barrier? Is those bars? But the one thing about those bars is, in those bars, there's a lot more than just racism. So if you grow up and you're born in an Asian immigrant who just came over, and you're here in the United States, and you have to deal in the United States, if you're from Southeast Asia, you're more likely to find yourself in the working poor part of society. Same thing with Latinx, being born in the United States, or African American and certain minorities, you're more likely to be born in poverty. But here's the thing, poverty knows no prejudice. So when we talk about those metal bars, in those bars, there are aspects that actually connect to white people. So think about that. And like one of the things is environmental justice, or how environmental issues have a stronger impact on minority communities here in the United States because of poverty and so forth, and they're mostly in urban areas. But here's the thing, climate change is spreading that burden across the board. And so that's another thing. Part of the bar, not necessarily attributed to my people, but can be felt by it. So think about that question. How do you explain, or how do you persuade white people on things? Be appropriate, pause it and go over it, and I'll go over some others. This one I will give my own answer and how I have done it in the past, and I still do it to this day. So go ahead and pause. Don't use my answer. Go ahead and do that. How do you think, remembering their intersectionality, those bars, but those inside of those bars, there's things that can connect people that are not necessarily part of the feeling oppressed, but there's sections of it, like social economic issues or environmental issues. How does that connect? Think about other things too. Education. All right? How would you pitch? How would you talk to white people about it? Pause it. Alright, okay, you're supposed to pause it now. Here's my answer. How do I explain racism to white people? I tell them, well, what they do to this one group, the burdens they put onto this one group, they will do to you. That's it. Because the way it was 10, 20, 30 years ago with economic anxiety, a lot of that stuff was field tested on other communities first, and now it's hitting everything. Think about the drug epidemic and opioids. That's hitting white America in a higher percentage more than other drug epidemics have. That's how you do it. What's happening over there can happen over here, or is currently happening over here in some variation. That's how you do it. That's how you sell it. It's not the greater good. You remember the self-interest thing. Remember the self-interest thing. You don't just say, hey, they're having this problem over here. Connect it to the problems of the group you're trying to reach. In this case, how do you explain racism to white people? All right. By the way, there's no wrong answers. This is just fleshing out ideas and going over it. And the last thing is spectrums of identity. So recently, this is some politics involved with this. Recently, there were reports that Donald Trump's campaign has done a little bit better with African Americans and Latinx demographics than they had in 2016 and 2018 GOP. There's some movement. It's a little bit. It's a little bit, but there is some movement there. So how does that happen? Well, there's this thing I talk about with the diversity one earlier. That's a thing I talk about. This is another one, spectrums of identity. Now, we've actually talked a little bit about it in our public speaking class, the individualistic and collectivistic, and how societies and cultures and demographics can fall into that category. Well, the same thing here with spectrum of identity. You take a person, let's say a Latinx male, and when we were talking about in the class about individualistic on one side is more towards the Spaniard part of the Meso mix, the individualistic or the European individualistic or American individualistic culture, compared it to more of the traditional collectivistic culture of the Americas, of the Native Americans and the indigenous of Central America and so forth. It's a spectrum where people can fall along the line. If you're more toward the individualistic, more towards the collectivistic. And then same thing with identity on issues. While you might find yourself, in the more common viewpoint of your group on one demographic than the other, same thing goes for multiple. So for example, I said the Latinx male. He might be more collectivistic here, but when it comes to his gender, he might feel more towards the spectrum of masculinity, having to portray masculinity comparative to being okay with your masculinity. Not saying that, not effeminate or masculinity wise, just you're okay with who you are, you don't have to portray it, and or you have to portray it. Alright? I'll give myself as an example. I was in the Marine Corps. I've jumped out of planes, I've done all these things. I don't care though about it. I don't have to, or I'm not a big tough, I don't have to do that stuff, you know? So I'll be more towards the I'm okay with myself, I don't have to prove it, comparative to that. So you see how this works. You can have, you fall on different parts of the spectrum. And same thing with gender identity, religion. And religion is a great example because there are people who are Catholic, but there's practicing Orthodox Catholics. And then there's, you know, church twice a year Catholics. Do you understand? That's how it works. The spectrum of identity. And if you go about it and you look at those reports about the small percentage moving toward Donald Trump that are from communities that have a very high negative viewpoint of him, then you find out that a lot of the movement is with men in those communities and the masculinity, or even some women who it has to deal with masculinity and identity and the machismo type stuff. And that is where the spectrum can come in, where you can have multiple spectrums that identify yourself and you fall along it. The best example, a historical example, is the 2008 elections, where the state of California overwhelmingly voted for Barack Obama, but also voted against gay marriage. They voted a constitutional amendment banning it. Highest number of Democrats ever to come out and vote. Highest percentage of people coming out to vote for Democrats. And the other issue that was big on that ballot, that was Democrats. A lot of the Democrats voted against gay marriage because, well, there were a lot of Democrats that came out and they identified Democrats when it came to President Obama. They identified their religion or their opinions on sexual orientation or gender identity over their political or their cultural identifications. See how this works? Spectrums of identity lets you know there's variety. I can get the whiteboard and show how when you take the spectrums and you match them up, you get the individual. So what you're going to do is you're going to pause and you're going to lay out your spectrums. You're going to go and just think about it. Think about, so I'm going to give myself an example. And there's no answer I'm going to give. I'm just going to give myself an example. As a white American, do I see myself more as a European progressive or the conservative, America? And obviously the European progressive because I'm liberal. When it comes to, I already did the gender identity. Religion, I'm a Unitarian Universalist, but I am very much not practicing. Actually, for a Unitarian Universalist, I'm practicing, but we don't practice in general. So there's lots of variations. Let's see what other spectrums can I do. Let's see, male, straight male. As a straight man, I don't know. That one's a little bit weirder. I think it's actually more to do with how you feel about others when it comes to, or yourself when it comes to sexual orientation. I am a straight male who's comfortable with others, comparative to maybe a straight male who's not. See how the spectrum works? So I want you to pause it, think about, give yourself one or two spectrums, ethnicity, gender, religion, age. I'm more get off the lawn type guy than a chill old dude. So do you understand? So give yourself spectrums and just create spectrums for your different demographics, and at least two, and see, and where you fall into it. All right, and that's it. Those are the three things. The first one was you're supposed to pause and come up with some uncommon demographics, or demographics that show variation in certain demographics. The second one was how to pitch racism to white Americans, thinking about intersectionality and the bars that can have common connections. And then finally, spectrum of identity, just identify demographics that you're part of and see where you fall on the perspective, on the spectrum that you create for it. At least two. All right, five extra credit points. It adds up.